I'd like to welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, and whomever you love, you are welcome here. This is our adult religious education series, which has up till now primarily been on a comparative religion sort of topic. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to do an introduction to the genre and the discipline of religious studies. And we'll introduce that by taking kind of the first element that usually is pushed at grad students when they take a course in religious studies, which is how do you define religion? It's usually the first topic they're given because it turns out it's more complicated than we think. So just kind of to review what we've done so far in this course. Primarily I've had an introduction to kind of the topic of a religious studies thing before. I did an introduction to comparative religion. And I did that in two parts, one in 2016, another in 2017, one called Similarities and Typologies, and the other called Differences and Divisions. And those are two ways to introduce comparative religion. And the links to those will be in the email or in the video description if you're reading it on or watching this online. Those are worth listening to and discussing too, and they're related to what we're going to do today. What they did is they said, well, one of the things you do when you compare religions is you look at the things that are similar, and you notice something about similarities that appear over and over again everywhere you look, and those tell you something important about human nature, because those are the things that are common across human nature. So that's one of the things comparative religion can do for you. The other thing it can do is you can look at the differences, and you can realize that there are ways of organizing society other than your own, and you can be exposed to different worldviews by looking at the differences. The differences also matter because they teach you something important about what the religion maybe intends. So when the Israelites do certain things, sometimes what they do is different than their neighbors because they're trying to be different than their neighbors. And so the differences matter too. So we talked about the ways the similarities matter, and we talked about the ways the differences matter, including the conflicts the differences create in our society today. To pretend that all religions are the same or one is nice thought, but it's kind of it blinds us to the truth of the real differences that divide us and that cause problems. We want to if we really want tolerance, we want to create a situation where we recognize differences instead of pretending we're all the same, but then we find a way to live together with our differences. And so those were the two introductions to comparative religion. Now, after that, we dove into a bunch of different religions. Right? We talked about Egyptian religion, Mesopotamian religion, Hinduism, Christian cathedral building, and we just discussed individual religions with this framework of a comparative religion topic. Religious studies, however, is something a little bit different than comparative religion. Comparative religion and religious studies aren't the same thing. Religious studies is a broader topic of an attempt to bring scientific worldview to the study of this thing humans do called religion. And you can bring that scientific worldview in many ways. One of them is comparative religion. But there's a lot of other ways to do it too. So we really need to differentiate religious studies from the things that came before it and that it's different from. So theology is what we see most of in Europe through most of the Roman period, Middle Ages, etc. And theology is different from religious studies because theology is an attempt to speak to a believer about your religious beliefs in a way that maybe helps them understand the teachings more, helps them live the teachings more. This is the inner religious discourse of the elite, the intellectuals in the religion talking to each other about their religion under the assumption that everyone is a believer. And that's not religious studies. Apologetics is not religious studies either. Apologetics is an attempt to defend the religion, either speaking to other religious believers or outsiders, and defend your beliefs against critiques. And so apologetics, of course, is what I spent a lot of time doing as a Mormon before I left the LDS Church. So that's apologetics. You're trying to defend the church from critiques from the outside. Hermeneutics is a little bit different, and when you get into hermeneutics, you're starting to move into religious studies. In fact, you could think of hermeneutics as one aspect of religious studies. Maybe I should have organized it that way. But hermeneutics is an attempt to understand. So think of a book by Jane Austen. Hermeneutics is an attempt to read that book, understand its cultural context, and figure out what the author was saying. And so a hermeneutical approach to religion is an attempt to understand the different religious traditions as they are, just to understand what people are doing, what they believe, what they mean to the people. And that brings us then to religious studies, which is a broad attempt, like I said, to apply the scientific method to the study of religion. So think of it like political studies. Right? There's political studies departments in some universities, and they're attempting to study this thing humans do called politics, figure out how it works, and create generalized rules and laws that govern the way politics runs. So when people started this religious studies enterprise, they thought they were going to be able to create rules and laws that govern how humans do religion in the broad sense. And when they teach in their universities, they often will say things like, I teach about religion, I do not teach religion. Which is a funny thing to say, because can you imagine a mathematician saying, I teach about math, but I don't teach math? But in the religious studies world, what they're trying to say is, I'm teaching you about how humans do religion, and I'm teaching you about the scientific things we've done to study that. I'm not teaching you to be religious or promoting a certain religious belief over another. So I'm not doing theology, is really what they're saying. And so it's the fact that religious studies grew out of these other things like theology that has caused them to take that distance from their own subject. So what started this religious studies movement in the first place? Well, like I said, we started with theology, but with the Protestant Reformation, there became a permanent state of diversity in Europe, of religious diversity. Whereas there had been a monopoly before that, now there's diversity. And that diversity led to a lot of strife, wars, conflicts, and there were a bunch of people who were really horrified by the violence they saw and the harm that they saw from this conflict. And so their theology, they were still doing theology, but it started to shift. In other words, they started to talk about things like how can we create a unity among religions? So they started looking at all the things that the different warring religions had in common, and they had hypothetical debates between different people in these books that they would write, where they would argue about how you could figure out which religion is true and which one you should believe in. And they often would make arguments like, well, the oldest one is true, right? Because Adam and Eve, we started with Adam and Eve in the garden, and then there was a fall, and so we need to find the oldest tradition, and maybe that's the true one. And if we can work this out and everyone can agree on these principles, then we can have a religion that we all agree on, and we can stop the fighting, basically. And then later on, some ethnographic data began to pour in from around the world. As globalization took hold, people started learning things about what was happening in Africa and in Australia and in South America. And as they began to look at the true variety of religious practice, they realized that these lists that had been created earlier, of kind of things all the religions do, were very Christian, Muslim, Jewish-centric. And they realized there's a lot more to religion than we thought. They also realized that the oldest religions are actually the more primitive ones. And that turned the whole fall variation on its head. And we came up with a progressive view where religions had evolved from a primitive state where people have small tribes, they have more primitive religions, and then as they grow into larger civilizations, then religions become more complicated as they support a larger sociological structure. And so that is now a progressive or an evolutionary view, which is, again, the opposite of what they assumed before when the fall was the primary belief. And of course, archaeology started to tell us things about the religious beliefs of the ancients, the real ancients, not just primitive tribes today, but, of the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. In fact, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he brought a whole bunch of scientists and archaeologists with him, and he created what we call Egyptomania in Europe, where they brought all these artifacts back, and everyone in Europe just really kind of was excited about these ancient artifacts, and the ancient religion of the Egyptians kind of excited everybody. So we have a milieu over several hundred years that moves from religious diversity to greater acceptance of potential atheism, to the Enlightenment, and the Age of Reason, and the discovery of ethnographic data from around the world, and archaeology, and all these things came together to create something we call religious studies, where people started creating in university departments, religious studies departments to study religion. So it became one of the topics of university, like you'd have math, chemistry, philosophy, political science, and religious studies. So we get these departments. But it's a little different than what you would see in a normal department. A chemistry department, people tend to have similar approaches to studying chemistry. There's a methodology for studying chemistry. There's a methodology for physics. There's a methodology for computer science. Each of these departments have kind of their own methodology. When you go into a religious studies department at a university, what you see are groups of people doing sociology, anthropology, abnormal psychology, positive psychology, economics, biology, sociobiology, evolutionary biology, history, archaeology, textual criticism. In other words, religious studies is almost like a topic. Instead of a department with its own methodology, it's a topic that borrows methodologies from the other departments and applies them to this topic we call religion, to try to understand religion using the lens borrowed from all of these other disciplines. So if it's a topic, the first thing we have to do to make sense of religious studies is define the topic. In other words, what is the topic we're trying to study, which is the subtitle of this talk, Defining Religion. And this quote by Mark Musi is enlightening. It says, "Scholars of religion now universally agree that there is not universal agreement about what constitutes religion." So as what you'd think defining religion is trivial, right? It's simple. A religion is a religion. There's the Catholics and there's the Muslims and there's the Protestants. Those are religions, right? So you'd think defining religion is simple, but it's not. And there's a lot of reasons that it's not simple. One of them is that there are exceptions to almost any rule you could create. So if I tell you what I think a religion is, I'm sure that I can find an organization or an institution that you don't think is religious that will match that definition. Or I can find an organization that is religious that doesn't match. And so that has caused some people to assume that religion either can't be defined, that there is no way to define it, or that it can be defined multiple ways. And my favorite description actually is that religion is fuzzy. There's the boundaries between what is a religion and what is not a religion are fuzzy. And there are multiple aspects to religion. And so it's difficult to have a definition that matches all the aspects at once. And so as we go through some of these definitions, I'll try to show one that I think does a reasonable job of that at the end, and my favorite definition. But there are many definitions, and there's no agreed upon one. And again, these corner cases are the reason. Buddhism is a big corner case because although most Buddhists are theists, meaning that most of them believe in gods and deities and things like that, Buddhism is practically atheistic. That's not the right term. There's a term for this. Anyway, it's methodologically atheist almost. So what that means is, although the gods exist, they're subject to karma too, and our job is not necessarily to worship the gods, but to find enlightenment ourselves, through ourselves, by our own efforts. And then, of course, there are variations of Buddhism that then turn that on its head and say, well, we attain enlightenment by worshiping gods and supernatural beings. But there's whole branches of Buddhism that don't believe in supernatural beings. There's other branches of Buddhism that do believe in supernatural beings, but basically find them irrelevant. It's almost like the background noise. The Buddha, of the culture. The culture believes in supernatural beings, so we don't deny those exist, but that has nothing to do with what we're teaching. And yet most people would consider Buddhism a religion. There's even a movement today that's sometimes called secular Buddhism, which is an oxymoron if you believe Buddhism is a religion, because secular means non-religious, and so it's like non-religious religion. And nevertheless, these people chant, they pray, they meditate, they join monastic orders, they keep a bunch of rules of commandments, and yet do not believe in the supernatural at all. Stephen Batchelor is an atheist who is also a Buddhist and wrote several books. One of the best maybe for reference is Buddhism Without Beliefs. And so then the question is what he is doing religious, even though he doesn't believe in God or the supernatural or karma, yet he finds allegories for things like karma that he finds useful, and he practices Buddhism, complete with ritual and community. So is that a religion? Confucianism is another one of those things that is almost a social organization. It's about how societies interact. And of course, we are Unitarian Universalists, and we are another one of those corner cases where there are people here who believe in God, there are people here who don't believe in God, some of us are atheists, some of us aren't. We don't care, but yet we get together every Sunday, we sing hymns, we hold hands, we listen to sermons, we build a church, we pay a minister, and we talk about it as a church. We even pray sometimes. Are we a social club, or are we a religion? Freemasonry is another fun one because they claim they're not a religion. They will swear up and down that they're not a religion, and the reason they do that is because they accept people into their religion, into their society, from multiple religions. On the other hand, you do have to believe in God. It just doesn't matter how you believe in God. And then they perform rituals and philosophy and ethics and codes of ethics and covenants and promises that are all deeply religious. In fact, by any normal definition of the term, those rituals, complete with the philosophy and the belief in God that goes with them, would entail religion. They would be a religion. And yet, they will claim they're not a religion, and they will allow people to be a Freemason and a Catholic, a Freemason and a Buddhist, a Freemason and a Mormon, whatever. Political parties are also fun because all of the mental, as we'll see, all of the mental faculties that cause people to feel the way they do about religions play a role in things like political parties, sports teams, especially when you have rivalries between sports teams, activate all the religious sort of concepts. And my favorite is the New Atheists. This one is a very controversial one because atheists will, rightly so, say that atheism is not a religion any more than not playing golf is a sport. Right? So atheism cannot be a religion because that's like saying not playing golf is a sport. And they have a point. And there's a lot of atheists for whom that's an accurate description because they don't believe in God, so they don't care, and they go on about their life. There are other atheists for whom their atheism is an identity setting as much as their race or their ethnicity or their gender. Their identity is piled up in their atheism. Their atheism forms a worldview, a coherent worldview that informs their ethics, their morals. They believe they know the problem with society, namely religion, and that they have the solution, and they evangelize aggressively. And so if you define religion as those sorts of things, evangelism with a coherent theological worldview about the existence or non-existence of God, together with communities and a set of identity, well then atheism, the new atheists at least, fit that definition to a T. In other words, they have turned their non-religion into a religion, and of course they will hate you for telling them that. And yet all the same emotional and psychological factors are at play. So these corner cases are exactly what makes defining religion so incredibly difficult, because every time you define it one way, you get something pops up that you don't think is a religion, like sports or the new atheists, that suddenly fit your definition. So then you have to wonder if that definition is right. When we define things, there are actually types of definitions. A definition can be intuitive. This is the Supreme Court definition of pornography. I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. But it can also be lexical. That just means you go through history and you look at how a term is being used by society, right? So this is what we find in dictionaries most part. You say, well, this is what the word means because this is how people are using it. So if I were going to try to define religion this way, what I would do is I would go back through the internet or a bunch of chat rooms, and I would look at how people are using the term. And I would say, this is the definition of religion because this is how people are using the term. The problem is if people are using it in different ways, depending on who's using it, then you can have many definitions. And that's why we have multiple definitions in dictionaries. That's not often useful if I'm trying to write a scholarly paper because there's too many definitions. So then we have the functional, which is where we say, when I use the term religion, this is what I mean. So a functional definition is one where you just start off telling people what your definition is, and then you use it from then on. And people know what you mean by the term, even if it's been used other ways by other people, because you've told them up front. And then we have the real definition. Real definitions are used by people who are doing polemics. They have an argument. They're trying to make an argument or make a point. Like they'll say, are Mormons Christians? No, Mormons can't be Christians because a real Christian believes in X, Y, Z. Mormons don't believe in X, Y, so Mormons are not Christians. When you see real definitions, you know you're facing somebody who has an agenda and who has a point they want to make, an argument. They want to get you on board with some sort of a idea. We also see this, for example, to be a real American, right? Or there's actually a name for this real definition when it's used to try to make points like this. It's called the no true Scotsman fallacy. And it's the sort of thing that happens when somebody says, no true American would ever lie, cheat, or steal. And so what you've done is you've defined all the lying, cheating, and stealing out of being an American by definition. And this happens in religion all the time because especially critics of religion will say religion is just superstitious nonsense, and then you point out something that's religious that is not superstitious nonsense, and they'll immediately say, well, that's not real religion. Because real religion is just the superstitious nonsense by definition. And that's a real definition, and when people use those, they're making a kind of a polemic point. So if we look at the lexical history of the term religion, it's from the Latin religio, and it meant to the Romans, it meant what the gods demanded, it meant pious practice and religious scruple. You notice there's no sense in that of a distinction between religious things and non-religious things, like between secular and religious. There is no secular religious divide. It's just religion means being pious. Everyone believed in the gods, and then there were the religious who were especially pious. So it's a degree of piety, you see. The idea of religion as a divide, a religious, non-religious, religious secular divide, is a Western concept, and it's a recent concept. And that's surprising to most people. People take the idea of the secular and the religious as separate modes of life almost for granted. And yet, that is not a concept we see in most of history, and in fact, most languages don't even have a word that we can use to translate that English concept of religion as a separate concept of the religious, the secular. So if you're going to do religious studies and you want to study the religious component as opposed to the secular component, then there has to be a distinction between the religious and the secular. And again, the very idea of a distinction between the religious and the secular is a novel and Western concept. In early Catholicism, we talked about the Roman idea. In Catholicism, religion had to do with the institutions of the church. Didn't have to do with, my religion versus your religion or my religion versus secularism. It just had to do with the institutions. And to become religious meant to take a religious order, to join them, to become a monk or a nun. And again, this modification of the term is new. This passage is long. I apologize I hate reading long quotes, but I think this is illustrative of the problem. We need to read this just so we can understand. The very attempt to define religion, define some distinctive or possibly unique essence or set of qualities that distinguishes the religious from the remainder of human life, is primarily a Western concern. The attempt is a natural consequence of the Western speculative, intellectual, and scientific disposition. It is also the product of the theistic inheritance from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The theistic form of belief in this tradition, even when downgraded culturally, is formative of the dichotomous Western view of religion. He's using a lot of just kind of technical terms, but we'll go through this in just a minute. That is, the basic structure of theism is essentially a distinction between a transcendent deity and all else, between the Creator and His creation, between God and man. And so what he's saying is that the Western concepts of the distinction between God and man sets up a dichotomy where they're more likely to see distinctions between what we do for God, the religious, and what we do for ourselves, the secular. So when we try to separate these out, if we try to separate church and state, again, that very distinction is a modern Western one because there was no distinction between church and state until very recently. If we try to separate politics and religion, or how about religious ritual and social ritual? If you think ritual is something religious people do, pay attention to what happens in a job interview. What happens when you meet a stranger on the street? What happens as you enter an elevator? What happens when you graduate from college? We have rituals that are social orders that tell us how you should interact with a person in a given context and situation, and without them, society would not function normally in a way that would make any sort of sense. And so we have these social rituals. How are they really distinct from the religious rituals? And are they? Again, if you lived in a time when religion was just another part of life, like walking into an elevator, then you have rituals for religion and you have rituals for shaking hands when you meet a stranger. And the distinction is nebulous, especially in religions like Confucianism. The distinction between science and religion is also novel and new, post-Enlightenment, because before that, religion said something about how the world was, and everyone thought that's how the world was. And it wasn't until we started using certain techniques to probe the world and realized they differed from what the Judeo-Christian tradition and Islamic tradition had said about how the world works, that we saw a distinction. And then we started to distinguish between science and religion. Philosophy and theology were the same thing. School and Sunday school were the same thing. Often schools were Sunday schools, and they taught reading, writing, and arithmetic too, and that's how you got an education. Ethics and commandments were not distinct. The tribe and the church were also not distinct. The tribe, your tribe was your church was your tribe. These are the same things. So again, these distinctions where we can say this is secular, this is the tribe, this is religious, this is the church, so let's study religion, the church, is, again, a late concept and a somewhat artificial one. So to study religion is, in many ways that people are sometimes loath to admit, is actually studying humanity itself. Because everything we do in religion, we do outside of religion too, and for similar reasons. But the definitions that are proposed, now that we see one of the reasons why it's hard to define, the definitions that are proposed seem to have two main types, the supernatural and the human, and you can kind of categorize them into the two. One says religion has, and there's a lot of variations. There's 1,000 different supernatural definitions of religion and 1,000 human definitions of religion, but one of them says that religion is some sort of belief in the supernatural or connection to the supernatural. That's what it is. And so those definitions will all have something about God, spirit, supernatural in them, and that's part of the core definition of religion. So if you define religion that way, then the new atheism, sports, etc., those things can't be politics, can't be religions. The other, though, is to define religion as a human institution. Paul Tillich, for example, said that religion is the ultimate concern of the individual. It's the thing of ultimate concern. So if you're a Catholic, your thing of ultimate concern is God because he is your ultimate concern. If you're an atheist and your ultimate concern is baseball, well, then your ultimate concern is baseball. So by Paul Tillich's definition, everyone is religious. We just are religious about different things, even if your religion is baseball. The human definition, though, is not just as trivial as Paul Tillich's. It's also people who attempt to define religion in terms of rituals and communities, etc. The things people do, the religious things people do. In that sense, it's apart from the belief. I should also point out that this emphasis of religion on belief is also a product of Western biases, because Christianity has really biased us, and so has Islam, in a certain direction. In Judaism, it's not even clear that there is an afterlife, but God's pleasure or displeasure has to do with how you behave, with what you do, keeping the mitzvot, the commandments. It's about ethics. Christianity is about faith, because it proposes that we can never be sufficiently ethical ourselves, so Christ died for us and will save us despite our mistakes if we believe in him. And so belief in certain theological points has become a primary Christian concern. And so we have a tendency to define religion in terms of beliefs, specifically because we in the West are biased by, when we think of religion, we think of Christianity, which is a very theological religion. Whereas, for example, Buddhism is a philosophical and a experiential religion. David Hume is the first person really to break with theology and to do what we would consider religious studies today. He did that primarily because he was an atheist, and at the time he lived, there was a certain amount of tolerance. Although he was turned down many positions because of his atheism, there was enough toleration of atheism that he was able to be an out atheist and to discuss what he thought about religion in a more open way. And for him, religion was just bad science. Primitive humans anthropomorphized powers they didn't understand, and then they tried to propitiate those powers to get them to get what they wanted from them. They would ask them for things and try to give them bribes to get the things they want. So for him, religion is just bad science. And so you'll notice as we go through the definitions, I also had that list of techniques applied. I want you to notice how the definition you apply to religion impacts the technique you use for analyzing it. Hume was interested in epistemology, the study of how you know what is true. So he wrote all sorts of philosophical papers on epistemology, how we discover what's true. It was very influential in that field of philosophy. And then he turned that epistemology to religion to show that religion is not good epistemology, and therefore we shouldn't give credence to it. In books like Of Miracles, where he said that miracles are hard to provide evidence for, the dialogue concerning natural religion is where he talked about where he thought religion came from, primitive humans, for example. Karl Marx is another famous one. He defined religion as the opiate of the masses. He said it was a technique or an ideology imposed by the ruling class on the subclasses in order to keep them docile and to promise them pie in the sky and the great by and by, so that they will be docile and submit to the economic repression that was imposed upon them. So he had both an origin of religion, it was imposed by the masses, by the leaders, and he had a purpose to repress the masses. So, of course, his primary tool for studying religion, as much as he did study it, is economics. So for him, religion is just economics. Whereas for David Hume, religion was just bad science. For Karl Marx, it wasn't bad science, it was just economics and intentional repression. It was part of a superstructure intended to repress the masses. Of course, we now know all sorts of things about, one of the more interesting, I don't have the name, I should have written this down. There is a study of slave religion in the antebellum South, which is very useful for evaluating how well Karl Marx's theory works. Because here we have a classical example of the theft of labor in slavery. And you will find that the slave masters did try to use religion by teaching certain sermons to the slaves about slavery, etc. They tried to use religion to make the slaves more docile. But very quickly the slaves began to use religion to make them less docile. They latched onto the Exodus narrative. They latched on to justice, social justice theology, and it did not have the impact suggested, despite the slaveholders' attempts to use religion as Marx had predicted. So we can actually look at some of Marx's predictions and see if they match up, and most of them don't. But nevertheless, this is an example of someone using economic theory to study religion. Other examples of economic theory, there is rational choice theory, which is a mix of sociology and economic theory, that says that people are trading in an IOU for something they want, like life after death, and they're willing to give up certain things for it, like go to church on Sunday, participate in certain rituals. But it also explains why certain people join certain churches. For example, the liberal churches are actually in decline in the U.S., whereas more conservative churches are holding steady. And one of the reasons for that might be explained by rational choice theory, which is a more advanced form of economic theory than what Karl Marx proposed. Essentially what it says is people are making choices for what they want. For example, I can pay $2 for a simple blade knife that doesn't do very much, or I can pay $15 for a Swiss Army knife. And so, yes, these more demanding religions do demand more of us, but they also give us more. They avoid free riders, and they produce a social good that the church produces together. And as we demand more of the people, there's more of that social good being produced. And people are making, this theory says, rational choices about which religions to join, etc., based on what they think will give them the greatest return on their investment. Which again, it's an economic theory of religion. William James defined religion as the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehended themselves to stand in relation to whatsoever they may consider the divine. So notice something about William James. It's individual, so he does not use sociology. For him, it's not a social thing. It's an experience of an individual. So William James applies the tools of psychology. So William James will study religion from a psychological perspective. And he will notice all the different ways and compile all the different ways that religious extremists, he was specifically looked for the extremists on purpose because he thought they were the experts. They would tell us the most about, these deep religious experiences because they had had the most deep religious experience. And so he tracked them and he cataloged all the different sorts of things that these people experienced in their religious ecstasies or practices. And he specifically looks at the experience. So it's a psychological approach to it. So you notice his definition determines his approach, determines the tool he uses to evaluate religion. And you'll also notice his definition sort of leaves out the average person who sits in the pew on Sunday, who is in a social institution, who may never have had some of these deep religious experiences that he's cataloging, but nevertheless participates in religion anyway. Again, this is why each of these definitions are problematic. Emil Durkheim goes the exact opposite direction. For him, religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. Emil Durkheim is a sociologist, if you can't guess. So he will apply the principles of sociology to studying religion, because for him, religion is a preeminently social thing, as opposed to the individual thing that William James had proposed. His favorite mode of explaining this came from ethnographic data from Australia, where they had these Tjurunga, I don't know how to say these, but these are these sacred stones that they would draw certain symbols on, and they would become sacred. And they were totems, and then people would dance and have these communal rituals around the totem. And these communal rituals had the purpose of uniting the community. In fact, he said the totem allows the society to represent itself to itself so that you can worship itself, or dedicate yourself to the society or the community. He noticed that once something became sacred, there were signs of the sacred. There were certain taboos. You couldn't say certain words. You couldn't treat it certain ways. It became a focus in the communal gathering, and it provided identity for the individual or group. And that's how Emile Durkheim, and this one has been very influential and has been very informative and powerful. This definition has been used for a long time, and it explains quite a bit about religious communities, but it also explains a lot about flags and NFL team logos and team mascots, right? Because these are ways for these teams, these groups, these political identities to represent themselves to themselves, and we usually end up with taboos, et cetera, around them. For example, in the American flag, you're not supposed to touch the ground. You treat it with respect. It's always raised higher than the other. These are the taboos that surround this symbol of us as a community, which we then use to engage in rituals like pledging allegiance to the flag in order to dedicate ourselves or rededicate ourselves to become part of the community. So again, we notice this secular sacred divide is in many ways artificial. The things that Emile Durkheim is noticing about the sacred rituals of the Aborigines also play a role in some of our secular institutions. One of my favorites is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud thought that religion was uniformly bad. It was what he called like a group neurosis, although he uses the term like in his definition and then forever leaves it out, because for him that's exactly what it is. A neurosis can cause you to believe things that aren't real, and a neurosis can cause you to engage in ritual practices and repetitive, obsessive, compulsive practices. Now, once you've seen this definition, it's really hard to forget it, because obsessive-compulsive disorder and religious rituals do have a lot in common. In fact, I would add, obviously some religions, without making it a statement about any specific one, it's very obvious that some religions believe things that are objectively untrue. And so, and you have to, even if you believe in your religion, all the others must be believing something untrue, right? So religions believe in things that are untrue. We know that, some of them do. And we know that they often have rituals that mimic obsessive-compulsive disorder. And once you've seen that definition of religion, it's hard to unsee. Now, obviously, because of his definition, Sigmund Freud will then apply the principles of abnormal psychology to his attempt to understand religion and to study religion like he would study any other neurosis that he wants to cure us from. So for him, religion is just a neurosis. Well, it turns out that all human behavior, including the desire to have repetitive rituals, is in all of us. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is a situation where that desire breaks out in an unhealthy way instead of a healthy way. And so Sigmund Freud's protege, Carl Jung, disagreed with Freud that all religion is bad, that all religion is a neurosis, and instead said that it's part of human nature to want things like repetitive rituals. And the therapeutic outcome when someone comes to you with a harmful religious practice or belief is to help them to transform their religious practice from an unhealthy religious practice, not into atheism necessarily, but into a healthy religious practice, where their religious rituals help them be calm, help them find peace, etc., instead of damaging their life. And he saw many therapeutic outcomes, he claimed, in his practice, where that was the outcome, rather than Freud's goal of, curing everyone of their religion. So there's obviously some truth to each of these definitions we've seen so far, but the problem is that each of them are incomplete. It's just a religious system of oppression. No, it's not. But it can be used that way. The slaveholders tried. It didn't work. Religion is just a neurosis. Well, no, it's not. It's a lot of other things. It also binds societies. It also gives us an outlet for our desire for ritual that all humans have to one degree or another. Religion is just an experience by William James. Well, that's part of it, but it also has these social. So each of these things is kind of leaving something out. Clifford Geertz says that religion is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing those conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. That's just a long-winded way of saying that religion is a mode of looking at the world, a bunch of symbols and a bunch of beliefs that create a mood and ethic that determines how people then behave. Because you believe certain things, you behave in certain ways. What's nice about his definition is it helps us establish that it is true that religions can bias people towards certain behavior. I mean, sometimes that's even unpopular to sort of say today. But there are religions, because of their teachings, that bias behavior in certain ways. So, for example, Islam is more prone to fundamentalism than is Christianity or Judaism. Now, you have fundamentalists in all of these traditions, and you have non-fundamentalists in all of these traditions. Why is one tradition more prone to it than another? And the answer is because of what the Quran claims to be, a dictation from God, direct, perfect. And so that pushes you towards Quranic fundamentalism, whereas the Bible, if you actually read what it says it is, claims to be the words of men who are trying to explain their experiences with the divine by some degree of inspiration. But the people are telling the story, and that gives you greater flexibility. So Clifford Geertz notes that the nature of the religious doctrine impacts the behavior. It shouldn't surprise you that he is an anthropologist. So he is applying his principles of anthropology to his study of religion. So for him, you would go into a group that has a religion that is not your own, and you would try to immerse yourself in their symbols and their systems of belief until you understand what their religion is like for them and how their religion motivates them to behave in certain ways. So he's the sort of person who would go out, this is the anthropological view, who would go out into the wilderness, find a tribe from Brazil somewhere, and embed themselves in that tribe's society and try to learn their modes and their systems of symbols and their ways of thinking. And noting that they're different from ours, you have to kind of immerse yourself in their worldview. And to try to find their worldview is the goal of the anthropologist. Let's see, what was I? There's something. You notice he says nothing about kind of the experience of the divine and all that sort of thing. Richard Dawkins says that religion is a mimetic virus. And of course, it shouldn't surprise you that he's an evolutionary biologist. So a meme is the equivalent of a gene, except it's a mental gene. And what he proposes is that our minds have created an environment in which ideas can spread, and they do exactly what our genes do when they spread. They duplicate, but they do so with variability, so they mutate, and they can even cross over. They can mate to combine ideas from multiple sets. And then they compete for a limited resource, namely our belief in them. And as they compete for that resource, some survive better than others, and the ones that survive better duplicate better and become more pervasive in society. And so religion is an evolved organism. Now there is, again, obviously some truth to the idea that religion is an evolved organism. That's how religions change through time. If you look through the history of religion, they're mutating, they're evolving, they're borrowing from each other, and the ones that are surviving best are the ones that continue and mutate and evolve and spread. So there's clearly some truth to his view. His assertion that they are a virus, however, is in some amount of doubt. Just because they evolved does not make them a virus. After all, there are multiple modes in which evolution can create a survivable species. You can become a virus, or you can become a symbiote. Whereas some religions might survive better because they help the people that believe in them to survive better. And that's not the behavior of a virus, that's the behavior of a symbiote. He also leaves some stuff out in the sense that religion is also invented and created by the humans who believe it, intentionally, which is a little bit different than just a virus that spreads in an unintentional environment. Religion spreads in an intentional environment where the people often will decide, this is how I want to worship, this is how I want to behave and believe, and they will, the mutations that are made, therefore, are not random, if that makes sense. Jonathan Haidt has pointed a lot of this out. He's pointed out that while religions do evolve, they may not be a virus so much as some of them are viral, right? There are cults that are clearly viral, especially things like death cults where everyone kills themselves at the end, right? That's a religion that took over and was a fatal virus to those who had it. But he points out that religion is also something that happens because of the way our brains evolved and what our brains want and like. And religion fulfills those wants and desires, and in some cases can help people survive. And those religions are the ones that survive better because the people who carry them survive better. In that sense, they're like a symbiote. And in his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, he points out that some of the cognitive biases that make people believe in some things in religion that are clearly false are the exact same ones that cause people to believe certain things in politics that are also false. And again, he's showing that the divide between the secular and the sacred is not as crisp as we would like to think. Politics is religion in that sense. This, however, is the definition of religion I'm going to use, and I have been using over the course of my lectures when I talk about comparative religion and when I talk about religious studies. I think this is the best definition for religion that we can use, and the reason for that is because in some senses it sidesteps the entire problem. Instead of defining religion, it describes it. So religion has a description. The things we consider religious tend to have things in common. So if we list the things that we have in common, then we can have a description of the things we consider religious. So for example, religions have ritual, forms and orders and ceremonies, private or public, and often regarded as revealed, but often, but not always, you notice. It has narrative and mythic qualities, where stories, often regarded as revealed, but not always, that work on several levels. Sometimes the narratives fit together into a fairly complete and systematic interpretation of the universe and the human's place in it. So we have a narrative thing that tells us of our place in the universe. We have experiential and emotional, where the religions is designed to create dread, guilt, awe, mystery, devotion, liberation, ecstasy, inner peace, bliss, in a private sense, often in a group, but it's creating that private experience for the group. But it also has social and institutional elements. The belief system is shared, attitudes are practiced by a group, often rules for joint identifying community membership and participation are present. It has ethical and legal elements with rules about human behavior, often regarded as revealed from supernatural realm, but not always again. Doctrinal and philosophical, systematic formulations of religious teachings in an intellectually coherent form. In other words, it has a philosophy. Material. It has ordinary objects or places that symbolize or manifest the sacred or the supernatural, etc. So, if we're going to apply Ninian Smart's definition to our corner cases, you'll notice that Freemasonry is high on the ritual, the narrative, the experiential, the social, the ethical, the philosophical, and even the material. So a religion is something that scores high on a lot of these, but not all of them. So for example, Judaism scores high in the narrative dimension and the ethical dimension. Christianity scores high in the doctrinal dimension. It's primarily a doctrinal religion, whereas Buddhism scores high in experiential religion, etc. So in fact, if I give you an example, let's take two religious denominations, because it's hard to generalize Christianity. Here's a Pentecostal church and an Orthodox church, and I've just kind of guessed about where they belong on these dimensions. If you're Pentecostal, it's all about experience. You go to church to speak in tongues and have that religious experience where you feel the Spirit. But they don't have a lot of ritual. They're what we call low ritual church. They have rituals, but they don't do the same sort of things that an Orthodox Christian would do. Orthodox Christians are incredibly high on the ritual dimension. Their rituals are incredibly intricate and profound and important. But they are much further down on the experiential dimension, because they're not there to speak in tongues and to have profusions of the Spirit till they fall over in ecstasy. That's not the goal of the religious service. The religious service's goal is to perform this ritual aspect. So there's two dimensions, and you notice that not every religion is high on all of them. But if you score highly enough on enough of these dimensions, then you are a religion. If you score low on all of them, then you are probably not a religion. And this is not a perfect definition, because it implies that things like the new atheists, by this definition, are religious. It implies that you could probably make a good argument that certain sports fans are religious about their sports teams. But I think that this sort of descriptive definition of religion is the best one we have and the most explanatory one. And I think about this from the perspective, admittedly, of a computer scientist, where we have dimensions. So here we have some what we call unclustered data on the left. It's just a bunch of points in space. And this is what we do when we name things. Tall, short. What does it mean to be tall? What does it mean to be short? Well, what we really have is a dimension, how tall you are. And we have another dimension, how fat you are, maybe. And then we want to say, what's your... so we think this is a bad example. Let me give you a better example. Iris. An iris is a flower, but we have different names for different types of irises. And we name them differently we determine that this iris is this kind of iris based on questions like petal length, color, etc. So if I take these things and put them in dimensions, color along one dimension, petal length along another, then I get a scattering of points. And then I name them. You see, the green points are this kind of iris, the red points are this kind of iris, the blue points are a third kind of iris. And then you can determine which iris is which from these points. There's a problem in computer science called clustering, which says you take a bunch of points in an n-dimensional space. I can't show you n dimensions, right, because I can only show you 2 or 3. It's hard to visualize. But imagine I had 7 dimensions, namely Ninian Smart's dimensions, right? And then let's assume that things up here are high on all the dimensions. Things down here are low on all the dimensions. So we're going to call these religion. We're going to call these politics. We're going to call these social clubs. And the first thing you notice about this is that the boundary might be fuzzy. You could probably put that boundary in a couple different places, and it would be okay. Now, the reason that matters is because that explains why there are so many things that people will disagree about whether this is a religion or that is not a religion, because it's about where they sit on that fuzzy boundary, on those 7 dimensions of religion. So the 7 dimensions of religion are useful because they help you to understand, when you're presented with a new religion, you can figure out where it sits on all 7 dimensions, and that tells you something about it. If you have something else, you're trying to decide if it is a religion, you can see whether it scores highly on those 7 dimensions, etc. This is the last one I'm going to use. This is by Stephen Prothero, and you've heard me talk about this before. He says religions have a problem, a solution, a technique for achieving the solution, and exemplars of people who have achieved it that you can then follow with rules and techniques, etc. So, for example, Christianity, the problem is sin. The solution is salvation through faith in Jesus Christ and his atonement. The technique for making that work is faith and works. If you do faith and works, you can make the atonement work in your life. And the exemplars are Christ, the saints, etc., who you follow to achieve salvation. In Buddhism, the problem is not sin, it's suffering. In Hinduism, the problem is rebirth, samsara. In Judaism, the problem is exile. In Confucianism, the problem is chaos and the solution is societal order. But in Taoism, we have the opposite. The problem is artificiality, so the solution is individuality and breaking out of societal order. In Yoruba, the problem is that we have forgotten who and what we are, and the solution is to reconnect to our past. And then the altogether controversial one, the new atheists fit this definition very well because they have a problem, a solution, and a technique, and exemplars too, because their problem is religion itself and the irrationality as they see it of religion. The solution is atheism and reason. The technique is science and good mental thinking, and the exemplars, we get people like Voltaire and the scientists and the new atheists and the great thinkers of the world, etc., that they will use as their exemplars. So, as you notice, how we define religion determines what approach we will take to studying religion. Sociologists study society and how societies are connected to each other. Anthropologists study culture and the human condition. Psychology, abnormal psychology, we see things like Freud. Positive psychology, we see things like Jonathan Haidt. Economics, we see things like Freud and like rational choice theory. And in biology, sociobiology, and evolutionary biology, we'll see people like Richard Dawkins talking about mimetic evolution. In history, we haven't really talked about history, but trying to figure out what actually happened in the past is an important part of religious studies because some of the religious behavior happened in the past. And some religious behavior today is based on a belief about what happened in the past. So history becomes important, archaeology becomes important, and because religion usually involves these texts, textual criticism and literary understanding is important. So these are the sorts of things you will get published in religious studies. Some of them are possibly arguable, whether they fit in religious studies or not, but I believe that they all fit. For example, we have Joseph Smith, a biography by Dan Vogel. So here we have a historian writing a biography of a religious leader, trying to figure out what influences from his culture there were that caused him to believe and think in the way he did. We have Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, where someone lists all the religious, the emotional impact they had. Mircea Eliade is one of the kind of founders of comparative religion. He believes religion is real, that there is a real sacred thing out there and that we experience it. And so he wanted to catalog the different ways people experienced this real sacred thing that he thought was not just in our brain but external. And so he created some of the foundations of comparative religion that are still read today. And then we have this book called Religion and Sexuality by Lawrence Foster, which is a fascinating sociological study where he said in the 18th century, family structures were breaking down, much as they kind of are today. And so people came up with all sorts of very interesting countercultural family structures and sexual structures, including Mormon polygamy, including the Oneida community of group marriage, and including the Shakers' attempts at celibacy. And so he compares all three and talks about them as a reaction to the uprooting things that were happening during the 1800s. And that's a sociological sort of study of religion. So these are the sorts of things that get published in religious studies communities, and each of them are using different techniques: history, psychology, comparative religion, sociology, etc., to try to say something about religion. And in the process, what we want to do is we want to avoid reductionism. reductionism is the practice of analyzing and describing a complex phenomenon in terms of a phenomenon that are held to represent a simpler or more fundamental level, especially when this is said to provide a sufficient explanation. In other words, what we don't want to say is religion is just bad science. We don't want to say religion is just a social organization to allow societies to represent themselves to themselves. We don't want to say religion is just oppression of the masses, because when simple things get put together in groups, there is emergent phenomenon that make that new phenomenon need to be studied at its own level. And so each of these definitions and techniques, the list of techniques we had, are potentially reductionistic until we use them all. And so kind of my point and my goal is Ninian Smart's definition to some extent avoids reductionism because it recognizes there's multiple dimensions to religion, which is why it's my favorite, because it avoids reductionism. The techniques that we've listed, we can also avoid reductionism if we use them each as a window. So imagine a complex shape and a flashlight, and each one shines a light on this shape from a different angle, and we look at the shadows that are cast, and we try to see the whole thing. We want to put them all together. We don't want to use any one to the exclusion of the others, because when we do, we miss out on some of the essence of what religion is. When we see what it is, and when we recognize that it's not actually as distinct as we thought from the rest of the human experience, then we can cast a light on human nature itself and learn more about who we are through this study of religion from multiple approaches and multiple techniques, which is the goal of religious studies. For additional resources, there's a really great courses lecture called An Introduction to the Study of Religion, which has a lot of the same material that I covered in it, and a great description of the history of religious studies as an institution, as it moved its way, from theology into religious studies and then into the different techniques for studying religion, sociology, anthropology. And he talks about all the early teachers and writers, and to some extent, a lot of the things that they have said have been superseded. We know they're not really true; they weren't quite right. But this really gives an overview of where the thoughts came from, and the history of how it all was put together, and what sorts of things are out there. So, I'm going to let us all go before we get snowed in too bad. I want to thank you all for coming. Yeah, and thank you all for coming, and I'll see you next month. And again, my primary focus is not on religious studies, it's on comparative religion. But I think it's worth taking a step back and seeing kind of the rest of what's going on out there in the world too. And so thank you for coming. Have a great day.